Good morning, everyone. This is our bright spot video for January 30th. It's hard to believe that we are already at the end of January and moving into February, but hey, that's how time flies sometimes, right? So if you are watching one of these videos for the first time, my name is Taryn Hewitt. I am a work-life balance coach and the organizer of this group, Work-Life Balance for Overachievers. And this is our weekly bright spot session where we aim to make Monday a bright spot in your week by providing tips and easy things that you can apply right away to help improve your work-life balance and create more time for yourself. So today's topic is how to find happiness now to improve work-life balance. So this is a topic that I absolutely love, and it's one of those things that I feel like we need refreshers on occasionally from time to time, including myself. And it's somewhat similar to the topic that we had last week, where we talked about finding some semblance of balance in order to actually achieve full balance, right? So what I mean by that is so many times when we are focused on work-life balance or our current perceived lack of work-life balance, we think about we tend to focus on the future state, and that's where our energy stays and lives, right? So in other words, if you think you don't have work-life balance right now, then you might find yourself saying things like, when I finally have work-life balance, this and this and this will happen. Or when I get to this point, then I'll finally be happy, right? So it's this future state thinking that we tend to fall into. It's one of those kind of like mental traps that's just really easy for most of us to see and to live in. And so what we're talking about today is how important it is to kind of pull yourself out of that future state and focus on the present state and finding happiness with your current situation, because ultimately that is what's going to help you find your ideal work-life balance and the ideal situation that you're ultimately shooting for. Okay, so let's talk about why that thought process of future state happiness doesn't work. So there's a couple of reasons. The first is that it continually reinforces in your mind that you can't be happy now, right? So if you're going to be happy when you eventually have work-life balance, then if you don't have the greatest work-life balance right now, your brain is just consistently telling yourself that you can't be happy, you aren't happy, that's not possible right now, right? It also creates or reinforces resentment towards whatever perceived obstacle is in your way, right? So, for example, if you believe that you don't have work-life balance because of your manager or your boss or your home situation, whatever the case is, there is oftentimes some kind of perceived obstacle that is preventing you from achieving work-life balance. And when you are focused on that future state, that whatever that perceived obstacle is becomes a source of resentment in the present state. Okay. And so what happens is when you have that resentment kind of being created and reinforced on a regular basis, it turns it into stress. And one thing that you'll hear, you've probably already heard me say this many times in the past, but you'll continue to hear me say it, is the more stress you're under, the more difficult it is to focus on anything other than that stress, right? So the biggest thing that we're always trying to move away from is this concept of stress. Now, I'm using stress a lot of times, that means very specific things to many people, but really ultimately what stress means is anything that's kind of a somewhat negative reaction or a negative emotion or thought, right? So that could be anxiety, it could be fear, it could be maybe like a view of lower self-worth, right? So there's a lot of things that fall under that term stress in the way that I'm using it right now. But ultimately, what it means is that you're creating all of these negative emotions, and your brain is going to very naturally focus on those negative emotions rather than all the wonderful things that could be in your life, all the wonderful things that you will eventually have when you achieve your ideal work-life balance. And so focusing on that stress or that negative emotion or thought ultimately stops you from making the progress that you're trying to make, right? So essentially, when you focus on the future state of happiness, what you're doing is ultimately making your life harder and making that progress towards that ideal state much more difficult and challenging, right? So what we're going to talk about next, having settled on that, is how do you actually find happiness now? So if you are in that state of stress, that can be a really difficult question to answer right away, right? So depending on where you're at, the idea of being happy right this second or being happy with the current state of things might seem completely impossible, right? I've been there before. I am honestly working through it now on a few things, right? So it's part of life, and it's one of those things that all of us will go through cycles with at different points. And it's understandable and completely reasonable if me saying, be happy now, feels a little light or naive or anything like that, right? So that's okay if you feel that way when I say that statement. What we're going to do is talk about what you can do and how you can work yourself into that present state happiness, at least at a level that's going to allow you to make progress towards what you're ultimately working on, right? So that's the most important thing, is we always want to focus on what helps us move forward rather than what keeps us stagnant. Okay. So the first question that you can ask yourself is, what would be required for you to be happy now? Okay. That's a very big question. I recommend journaling with it a little bit because I'm a big fan of journaling. But part of the reason I also am a big part of the reason I recommend journaling so often is because it helps us get these thoughts out of our head. So if I say that, that's a very big question. What's required for you to be happy now? And your brain, if you let that sit in your brain, it's gonna probably bounce around to a lot of different things, and it might be hard for you to truly capture what those specifics are. And so journaling is going to help you identify the specifics and then work through them, right? So what I would recommend is actually listing things out and then working back through that list and asking yourself, how can you bring those requirements into fruition? Okay. And the big thing that I would say to hold on to here is that we're not necessarily trying to get things to the perfect state right this second, right? You have a future state that is what we're going to call ideal. And what you're trying to do is get yourself in your current state to a level of happiness and a level of satisfaction that gives you strength and energy and mental fortitude to continue pushing towards that, right? So if you're looking at those items, it doesn't have to be perfect, but maybe I'll just give an example. Let's say that your requirement for being happy is that you have more me time, right? So, and right now it feels impossible to get any semblance of me time in. Then can you find 5 minutes in a day that is 100% for you? Can you find an hour in a week, right? Can you find, I don't know, 20 minutes every other day, right? So it's about how you can kind of get creative with it to get that first piece of the puzzle in place. We're not trying to get the whole puzzle in place. So the next thing that I would recommend is actually, I would recommend considering the balance quadrants that we discussed in last week's video. So if I say that and you missed last week's video and you're not sure where to find it, drop a note in the comments and I can tag you in it so that it's really easy. But last week we talked about these balance quadrants that you can use to kind of identify where you have where you might be out of balance. And it was a very similar discussion, right, about finding kind of baseline balance now in your current state so that you can find ideal balance in your future state. And what I would recommend is using those balance quadrants to kind of analyze what this point of stress is that's currently in your life. So, for example, if your job seems to be the big obstacle for, related to your work-life balance, analyze your job against those four quadrants, right? So how can you find some level of balance within your job itself by finding something in each quadrant that allows you to kind of focus on potential satisfaction associated with your job, potential fulfillment that maybe you could potentially be losing touch with or might have already lost touch with because you are under stress and things are not in your ideal state. Okay. And then the last thing that I'm going to recommend is, man, this is going to sound like a big ask again, but it's remove or deflate the power of that perceived obstacle. So again, I don't necessarily mean, like, if I'm saying remove the obstacle, and I just said an example of an obstacle could be your job, right? I'm not saying quit your job. I'm not saying walk away from that, but you're removing the energy of that. So the way that you can do that, or you can kind of shift the energy that you have associated with that obstacle, is by asking yourself a few questions specific to it. So one is, how does this job, person, situation, whatever that obstacle is, how does that enable happiness or progress towards your goal? Okay. And then, and what I would say with that one is, again, this is a good one to do in a journaling exercise, but a good thing to do here is to, depending on what your situation is, it might be to kind of reflect backwards on other points in your life where you have been happy with this job or this person, whatever the situation is. Has there ever been a point in your life where you have been happy with it? What changed? How can you bring those pieces back into your current state of affairs? Those are all things that you might think through as you're journaling on that question. And then the next question is, how can what you're going through serve you or others now or in the future? Okay. And so a good example of that might be, perhaps you're going through a really difficult situation at work, and you've already made the decision that you are going to change jobs or change careers or whatever the situation is. That's fine. That's a very common decision in circumstances like that, where it seems like you've done everything that you can do for yourself and the external forces are too big, right? However, what can you still learn in that situation that might make that next job or that next career, whatever the case is, successful, right? If you were to come across those same challenges, how can you build up muscles right now in the face of those challenges that will serve you later? Or depending on what your circumstances, is there anything that you can learn or you have learned from your current state of affairs that will help others? Because oftentimes when we shift our energy into helping others, that also brings us into a state of joy and breaks up that feeling of stress and those negative emotions. So there's a lot of questions that I've asked in this. Hopefully you've taken some notes. If this is something that sounds important to you, obviously you can go back, you can re-listen to this. But hopefully this gives you a few things that you can work through and you can actually think about and play with a bit on the side in order to find happiness in your current state that will allow you to continue making progress towards that ideal future state, which is the big dream, right? That's the thing that all of us want. And that's what I know you can achieve if you just take the time and the energy to figure out what is happening now and how you can shift your thoughts on that. Now, all of that being said, I've said this already once in this video. I will say it again. What I just talked about is not necessarily easy. So depending on the level of stress that you're at or what it is that you're going through, the questions that I just asked in this video may feel completely impossible. And if it does, that's normal, right? So don't feel bad about it. Don't beat yourself up about it. But what I do want you to think about is that it is possible. No matter how difficult it feels, I promise you that you have the ability to do this. You have the ability to shift these thoughts, to think about this differently, and to find happiness right now that's going to help you get that ultimate happiness that you're eventually going to reach as well, right? So if you are struggling with this, if this seems impossible, no matter what you do, please send me a message. This is what I love to help people with. And it's probably the piece that is the hardest to do on our own sometimes. And so it makes sense. It's perfectly reasonable if you need help with it. Okay. So that being said, I hope that this was a really helpful video, that you walked away with some really great tips, and that everybody is able to make some tiny shifts in the next few days to start finding a little bit more happiness right this moment. In the meantime, have a wonderful rest of the week, and I will see you next week with our next Bright Spot video. Thanks. Bye.